Hola. I wanted to give a few just thoughts and notes and experiences about managing and preparing your data in terms of analysis. And here we see, just a ton of information that could be your data. And how do you deal with all these things? So, one thing is to think about what is your data? In what form will your data exist? And this is something that an institutional review board will ask you if you have to go through human subjects, ethics committees. What is your data? And in qualitative, it's usually transcripts of recordings. It might be the recordings, it might be your written notes, your audio files, photos, videos, websites, PDFs of reports, databases, maps, anything can be your data. So you have to really think about, what am I collecting? What am I organizing? You also you have to think about what you want to know about your participants. And I will in next week give you information about demographic forms. But do you want to know anything about your participants, or do you just want their responses? Do you want to know who is responding and how they might differ from other people, such as by age or um, uh, educational standing, things related to what you're interested in your topic of your research, and your contextual notes about them. So one way that we manage our data is to transcribe our recordings. And that's a big deal in research that is qualitative, having to transcribe what you've listened to, what you've recorded. It can be super expensive if you have somebody to do it, but if you have funding to do it, that's great. So what you can do is you can listen to your recordings and then transcribe it, either thoughts, paraphrase, or verbatim, every single thing a person says, or somewhere in between. So here you can just transcribe it yourself into a Word document. You can send out for transcription. Usually people will charge by the minute. Sometimes they charge by the word. It can be thousands of dollars if they're very difficult to transcribe. But good transcriptionists are wonderful. They'll train people to do it, and they might do it 2 times and then match up your transcripts to make sure that they're most accurate. And they're very well done, but you have to give them a lot of input on how you want things transcribed. You can just listen to the recordings and write your notes. You can use DragonSpeak, where it picks up the voice and records for you, or that you might even have to repeat into the DragonSpeak what the person you're hearing on your audio is saying. You might do phone dictation. And one thing that we have found is that you can actually upload your transcript as a file to YouTube, keep it private, but when YouTube has a file, they'll transcribe it for you. And so I've been working on this with other students. So there are different ways to get your audio files or your video files into a managed way that you can actually start to code the information. And usually you want to have some kind of written transcription of what you're hearing so that you can start to really put codes to what you're doing. So analysis, it's like wading into an ocean of data. And I'd like to talk about coding and code books and memos. So when we're working with our data, we're usually doing something called content analysis. And there are different types, but this is just a general overview of what we're talking about and what you've been doing, what you did for this week. There's the preparation phase where you immerse yourself by reading what you have. Organizing, which is coming up with codes. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What notes are you writing in your margins about things? And that's called open coding. You might group ideas into categories or codes so that you are constantly comparing across what you're seeing. And if you start hearing the same things over and over again, you start to name them the same thing. You're constantly trying to reduce the number of codes by thinking about how are things similar or dissimilar, that I can start to name them and put them into different little buckets. Then you might categorize higher order themes, like the idea that some codes might fit into a general overarching theme. And then you want to also name and specify categories and maybe even see how they're related to other categories. So to go a little bit into more detail, when you're immersing yourself in the data, what you're doing is you're reading. You're trying to get an idea of what is the content. Are you getting the information you wanted? What are some emergent themes and tentative explanations that you're getting? You might start writing memos about this to yourself, writing notes to yourself about this. Any surprising topics that you'd like to explore as you move on with your data. You want to look at the quality of your data. Is the data superficial? Is it really rich? Are you going to have to call people up and get a little bit more information? Or do you feel like you have rich enough information that you know that you can actually really get some information out of what they've told you, what your participants have told you, or what notes you've taken? Are your observations vividly described? Is sufficient contextual detail provided? What might be changed to improve additional data collection? This is theoretical sampling, what we talked about, where you go on a certain vein of inquiry just based on what you've heard so far. So this is really like wading into a lake instead of diving in head first. You're getting a feel for what you have and what you might need to do. Coding, or organizing and identifying themes, is very, very much a part of what we're talking about. We're trying to find things that you're able to, develop these specific ideas of what you're seeing in your data within a person or an event, or across a person or events. Okay? And that's what we talked about in terms of developing code books. You want to listen to the data for emergent themes. And this is called open coding in our book, where you're writing notes in the margins just to start naming what you're seeing. And there's no standard rules for how to code. It's an iterative process that requires time, tenacity, and going back to update your coding, because you're constantly changing what you name your codes dependent on how you see those codes as you move on with your data collection and your data analysis. So researchers differ on how to derive codes, when to start, and level of detail required. So it's really up to you how you're going to look at your data and how you're going to start to see your codes. And that's why I ask you all the time, what was your process? Because your process is your own. I learn a lot from hearing about your processes, and your processes are very similar across each other, but sometimes somebody will come up with something really interesting. You want to label segments of text as themes and concepts as they emerge. And it's usually to help and write them down in the margins of your paper. And it's good sometimes to use words or parts of words to flag ideas that you find in your data. Now, there's something called deductive coding, where you look at themes that fit into an a priori theory. And we talked about that with the quality of life model. There's also inductive coding, looking at themes that emerge just from the data, not trying to go in with a blank slate and just let the data talk to you and not have any a priori theory. And code names can be borrowed from science, such as self-efficacy, or they can be borrowed from the participants' own words. It's really good to keep track of how you came up with your ideas and decisions. Maybe take notes about your own coding, your own analysis process. And that's what we talked about in terms of rigor, really keeping a diary or a journal of how you come up with things so that you know your coding decision making and how it came to be. So as you code, you develop a code book that includes definitions and boundaries, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I'd like to just end by talking about segmenting. So far I've given you a lot of quality of life data, which were just very small little snippets of what people said about how they look at quality of life. But what if you had a huge transcript of somebody talking about their life, or they go on and on about an experience? How are you going to segment that? And that's up to you. Again, it's up to the researcher because sometimes people will look at each word and look at what words are like with the meaning of words, and that's really getting into the essence. Sometimes people will look at a line of text, even if it's not a complete sentence, and they just get an idea of what that line of text is saying. I usually do it like here in this picture on the left. I usually use a paragraph or a full thought to really segment out my data. And that way I'm able to see how many themes or codes I can see within one thought. And that is a meaning unit to me. But again, that's something that you might hear differently from other people, or you might have a different idea of how you like to look at your data. And again, it's up to you. So I'm going to stop here and then we'll continue on with our second part.